How did you get along with the lieutenant governor?
Always well. I respected him. He was honest, ethical, serious. Took his work very seriously. He respected me. He was fair to me, and I would bend over backwards to try to support him. And when I didn't, I would tell him. I mean, we had a very open dialogue about what was going on. Mm-hmm. There was a time that, I guess get to this, but there was a time when a group of us challenged the leadership, but that was pretty rare.
Well, tell us about that.
Oh, you want to jump to that? Well, I had been, let's just say, one of the things that I was interested in was in limits on government, and particular. I think you could say I was more or less a libertarian, both on social issues and on government powers and economic issues. Some of this has changed over time. I've gotten old and a little bit more liberal and softer on the government side, more tolerant of taxation and spending, which is why I'm not running for office now. Certainly not in South Georgia. But at the time, one of the things that I felt strongly about, and one of the issues that I carried around, was the idea for a constitutional amendment to limit state spending, a la Colorado. And I'd been to national forums about this. I was friends with people in the national tax limitation movement. And I mean, we were ahead of our time. This was something that really came more into the public conversation during the Reagan presidency than during the Carter presidency. But that was where I was. And I just wanted to, I knew that the bill wasn't going to pass. Certainly not as a constitutional amendment. Getting it through the House with the Speaker, the idea of such things was funny. But I did want to get a vote on it. And at the same time, some of my colleagues had bills that they wanted to get out. Lee Robinson, who was a good friend of mine and sort of often a partner in crime, Lee was from the Macon area, by the way, wanted to get a sort of a modified form of a public initiative passed. Again, constitutional amendment, required special session, required a 2/3 vote. And Bob Bell had a bill that who was a Republican, had a bill that put a cap on the process for spending. I don't remember the details of it now. The three of us got together to try to use a hitherto, a process that had not been used for, I don't know, 100 years or something like that, where you called a special session by getting a certain number of signatures of members of the legislature. And so we were basically going around the leadership to try to get our bills on the calendar, have a special session. We didn't succeed. We got more signatures than you would think. I think 14, 15 signatures. I don't know, in the Senate. That's not terrible, but it's not. We needed 28. So it didn't work. But that is the only time that I can say I remember having anything like a real challenge to something. I mean, we were in conversation about it even then. It's not like I was called on the carpet or that sort of thing. It wasn't that kind of relationship. I think that Zell, one thing I like about Zell is that the difference between his style of leadership, which was appropriate to the Senate, I think, as it was constituted then, and Speaker Murphy, was so vivid. The contrast was so vivid. Speaker Murphy was an autocrat, my way or the highway. I never liked him. I thought he was a son of a bitch. I just, you know, I'm sorry. I know he's dead, but I thought he was. I thought that he wasn't that interested in issues. He was interested in power, and I didn't respect that. He just wanted, you know, if you're only passionate and your only reason for being in that building is power, why are you there? That's not a good reason. Zell was completely different. He was very careful, even if he disliked someone or, you know, his least favorite people. He was very careful to treat them fairly, to give them a forum, and he did have positions on issues which he tried to make clear. I mean, you know, he tried his best on the things that he felt strongly about. So, you know, that's sort of where that came down.
Did you support Zell Miller when he ran for governor the first time?
I wasn't here. I don't think. What year was that?
That was 1990.
Oh no, I was in New York. I was long gone.
Tell us about New York.
Well, let's don't get to that yet. I want to talk.
But you promised you'll tell us.
All right. Well, you've got plenty of film, and you know, we beat the traffic if we wait long enough. We'll have food brought in, or. Let me talk about a couple of bills and maybe talk about some of the people that were there in the Capitol, because I think it, you know, this is a chance to say a few things that might be useful to someone. I don't know. There was my first piece of legislation was totally symbolic, and there were things. I'm sorry. Let me frame this a little bit differently. When you come from a district like mine that is very conservative, was and is very conservative, now it's a Republican bastion, and also very poor, was and is, and very rural, and in some ways I am not the perfect match for that district. I'm just not. I know that. I am, you know, I lived there, and I loved everybody in my district. I can say that I did, and I did. You know, I loved getting out and meeting people and getting to know them. And one of the things about being in the legislature is it gives you an incredible entree into the whole world of your district. Every kind, at that time, it wouldn't have been easy or normal for a 20-something young white business guy to be going to black churches, black restaurants, black clubs, for you to be meeting with people whose children had disabilities, hanging out in with the teachers in school lunchrooms, you know, all those kind of things. You didn't do that, you know, you went to work every day. You just didn't meet such a broad swath of people. I did, and I loved them, but I was, you know, just am from a different space, and I knew that. And so I tried to reconcile the differences by, there are some things that I did with it that were almost intuitive and symbolic. Chewing tobacco, which was, I don't know, I had picked up at some point, and became a point of identification. When I came to the Senate, there was something in the rules that said you could have a spittoon, and they had moved all the spittoons out because there was nobody else that chewed tobacco on the Senate floor. I had the spittoon moved back in so I had to go find one so that I could chew my tobacco. I don't chew tobacco now. I gave it up. But I was just trying to think what some of the gestures were. I guess the fire ants thing would have been one of those touchstones. And I spent a lot of time hanging out with the farmers in my district, because I came from a very agricultural district. My first bill was a bill to make the peanut Georgia's state symbol, obviously replacing the peach, although the peach had never been officially adopted. So this was like, we were going to adopt it as a state symbol. That set off a turf war. I discovered, by the way, that I had a couple of peach farmers. I didn't even know it, and they were friends. I just didn't know that that's what they did. But you see, Jimmy Carter was president, newly elected. So there was this whole thing about peanuts, and I lost. The pine tree people got in that, the chicken people, and everybody came to the Capitol, and we all had the battle of the little lapel stickers. But it was harmless, and it was a gesture, and I hope it was good for the peanut farmers. But you have to pick your battles. And I think more so when you're from a district where you don't agree with your people on everything, then there are times when you just have to decide what to take to the wire. What are some good examples? We never had much vote in the way of gun control, so I don't think I had to do battle on that. But I mean, I can remember voting. Every bill you have to make a decision. Is this something that is so offensive that I'm going to vote against it, even though I know it is very popular in my district, and I'm just going to have to take my licks? The reverse of that would have been the ERA. I believe I was the only, well, I'm pretty sure I was the only member of the Senate south of Macon to vote for the ERA. I knew that it was wildly popular in my district. I knew it wouldn't pass. There's really no reason for me to vote for it except principle. I was able to cover, I caught hell for that when I went back home, and I was able to cover that by something that I thought was kind of clever. I was able to say, truthfully, that it was the only time that my mother had asked me to vote for something. But sometimes there'll be something that is a little bit odious. I probably wouldn't support it if I thought it was going to pass, but it's not going to pass, so I just don't want to take, you can't vote against your people all the time. And so sometimes you make a judgment, or I did, to support something because this is not the time to call in a chit. But my battles were probably the ones that I would say are my legacy issues were environmental. And there were a lot of them. I sort of was the person in the Senate who carried the water for the environmental groups on a number of really key fights. And unfortunately, it tended to be where you were fighting something, with one exception. But there was the exception would have been the bottle bill. At that time, there were only really two people lobbying full-time or more or less full-time at the Capitol as environmentalists. Now they have a huge room full of people. But at that time, there was Betsy Loyalist. You know Betsy, a wonderful woman. Later became senior vice president of Audubon and head of their Washington office. And she represented a coalition of environmental groups, or all the major groups, really. And then there was Jim Marson from Georgia Wildlife, and you know Jim. And I think it was Betsy who came to me and said, "We want you to sponsor a bottle. Would you be willing?" That's what I said. "Would you be willing to sponsor a bottle bill?" And I said, "You mean a deposit on Coca-Cola bottles? Yes, yes. Obviously, this is, you know, Coca-Cola's, you know, there were Coca-Cola machines in the cloakroom of the Senate. It's just like the Coca-Cola estate. They pick up the tab for, at that time, for everything you did, you know, that you know, the power structure did. So we talked about it, and it was, they knew it wasn't going to pass, but they wanted to start a conversation about it. And ultimately, after some discussion, I agreed to put the bill in. And we had intentionally kept this to ourselves until I dropped the bill in the hopper. And then all hell broke loose. Huge reaction. The next morning, after I had dropped the bill in, I stumbled into the Capitol at, I don't know, 7 o'clock in the morning or something. I usually would come in early to read the calendar and, you know, that's read the bills and do whatever I was going to do. And usually very quiet. And, you know, at that time our offices were in the basement. And there were just people all over the place. And they were all from my district and from a few people from neighboring counties. And what had happened was Coca-Cola had sent a plane down and at 4 o'clock in the morning had loaded up all of the soft drink bottlers and the beer distributors and some of the grocers and from all over my district. And these, you know, soft drink bottlers are politically influential. They're, you know, they're your friends. And so there were all these people waiting for me. And they wanted me to, there was a process where I could withdraw the bill if they did it that day. So that's what they wanted to see me early. And so they made their case. And I said, well, you know, it's not going to pass. And they said, well, so why do you want to introduce it? I said, well, I want us to have a conversation. And they said, well, we don't want to have a conversation. And I said, well, I'm not going to withdraw it. So sometime later, one of those bottlers was one of my good friends. And I asked him, I said, how much trouble am I in? Because I was worried. And he said, oh, I was kind of proud of you for not caving in. But what happened that is indicative was that, and it's kind of sad, was that a short time later, I mean, obviously I didn't write that bill. It was written by the environmental groups, the attorney for the various environmental groups, who all had signed off on this. But it turned out that Coca-Cola was the biggest single donor, I believe, to the Georgia Conservancy, which of course was the most powerful environmental group in that coalition. And they came under pressure. And we wound up, I'll cut to the chase, but we wound up having what amounted to a trial in the boardroom of Coca-Cola. In the Coke boardroom, with this you know, big walnut boardroom with Mr. Candler looking down from over one fireplace and Mr. Woodruff looking down from over the other fireplace, with the Georgia Conservancy board sitting in the chairs around the board table. They agreed to go to Coke's location. And Betsy and our little scientists, we made our presentation, and then Coke's scientists got up and explained how, you know, container legislation really wouldn't do anything for the environment because what it would take to wash the bottles would use up more energy than some absurd argument. And ultimately, the Conservancy board voted a statement that said, and this is almost verbatim, while we endorse the concept of container legislation, we do not endorse this particular bill. They had written it. They just left me hanging. So that was the one. That's the one I remember as a bill I actually had my name on as a sponsor. Most of the environmental stuff was trying to beat bad bills. One that I remember particularly was in 1978. It was the Parks-Brown Amendment. Parks-Brown, who was a low-key guy, nice fellow, member of the Senate, who didn't ask you much. He rarely had legislation, so people were inclined to go along with him, and he'd been there a long time. Senator Brown had an amendment to some bill that basically removed trout stream protection from most of the Savannah River. Oh, you remember this?
Mm-hmm.
And I led the opposition, and we had a series of votes, and ultimately beat it. But it was after a lot of reversals and people changing sides. It was a protracted battle and a hard one, because people weren't voting on the merits of the legislation. They were voting because they liked Parks. You know, they didn't want to vote against him because he never asked them for anything. The other thing that I think is the most important piece of legislation I ever did battle against, and that is something that's completely forgotten today, but I think is significant. In 1979, a bill emerged that had passed the House unanimously. And the background of it was a little complicated, but in general, you can have a tri-state compact if if the majority of the states involved support the legislation asking for the compact. You have to get the congressman to go along, but generally they do that if you get the majority of the states to ask for it. And you can do almost anything with a compact. This was about controlling the Chattahoochee, Apalachicola, Flint River system, controlling the water flow. And it had already passed the Alabama legislature and been signed by the Alabama governor before it came to Georgia. Betsy read it, or someone read it and brought it to Betsy and said, I think this is a really strange bill. And she finally had somebody who was an expert on compact law to read it, and it had been written by someone who really understood a lot about interstate compacts, because it was drawn right at the edge of that kind of law to create a body, the majority of whose members were appointed by the ports authorities in the various states, that would ultimately control the water flow in all of those rivers. So what do the ports want? They want, when you have a drought, they want to float their barges down in the shallow part where you need to get out to the coast, you know. And so we're talking about draining Lake Lanier and my little lake, Lake Blackshear, and whatever you need in order to float those barges. That's what this was about. But that wasn't what the conversation had been. The conversation was, this is an innocuous bill to support the ports authorities and give them some voice in the river management. Well, it was a very tough battle about the future of, among other things, the Chattahoochee River. And it was very hard to get people in Georgia interested in it. The idea that Atlanta might run out of drinking water was not something that it was considered such a foreign concept at that time that it's laughable. It just wasn't a discussion you could have. The Atlanta papers covered it, but not on the front page. The coverage that it got in Georgia was basically in places like Columbus, where I was treated like a leper. I mean, I was like the Antichrist. And in Florida, where this bill, because I have to give you a little background so you understand this. The importance of this to Florida was that the entire Gulf fishing industry depends on the life of the estuaries, which depend on the cycles, the flooding cycles that come in the river. And if you mess up those cycles, you mess up ultimately the fisheries, that whole industry there. So Florida was apoplectic, and we're getting a lot of publicity in Florida, and the Florida environmental organizations were very interested. Of course, they have no influence in Georgia. So it was one of those things that you just have to try to persuade people to do the right thing. And I lost on 2 different votes. Each time, I believe, by 2 votes. It was close, but we got beat. But meantime, I was on a committee called the Committee on something like Community Affairs, and Governor Busby's transportation plan for Metro Atlanta was locked up in that committee. The suburbs were against it. The inner city, the governor was for it, so the governor's forces were for it, and it was basically a tie. And I was the tie-breaking vote. And of course, my people didn't give a damn about Atlanta's transportation system. They just didn't care. So I was footloose. I would have supported it, but I wanted to get my Tri-Rivers bill beaten. So the governor summoned me in, and he said, "Well, what do you want?" I mean, why beat around the bush? And I told him, I told him this bill. I said, "I want you to veto this bill." And he has a very expressive face. He said, "You want that?" He thought I was going to ask for a jail or something, a prison. And I said, "That's it." And you could tell he really wasn't even that familiar with it. He said, "Okay, let me study it and I'll get back to you." Meanwhile, we got Bob Graham to actually come and meet with him. But Bob Graham was governor of Florida at the time. Came and met with him. And that gave him some cover. And so towards the last days of the session, I mean, obviously he probably tried to get that bill out of committee without having to deal with me, but towards the last days of the session, what's his name, his administrative assistant?
Tom Perdue?
Must have been Tom Perdue. Tom Perdue came over and got me and he said, "All right, it's a deal." So I voted for it, and we got our veto. So we saved Atlanta's water supply, saved our rivers. Mm-hmm. This was before, every time you read about the three states and the rivers, it always talks about 1981 as the date when all of these battles started. This was the original, as far as I know, this was the original three-state, three-river battle. I was involved in prison reform. I mentioned I'd been on that committee, and that sort of was the genesis for some interest in trying to do something about the prisons. And not so much trying to make living conditions better for the prisoners, but trying to make the prisons more effective in terms of, rehabilitation, not being factories for crime. And in my approach, which I was successful at, I mean, got some bills passed, was ultimately about trying to strengthen and finance something that doesn't sound like a good idea, but the county correctional institutions. Everything that we were able to discover showed us that they had a lower recidivism rate at that time, I don't know what happens now, than people who came out of Reidsville or the big state prisons. And prisoners preferred to go to these the heirs of the old chain gangs, which had been cleaned up. They preferred to do that, where they got out and did work, rather than being locked up in these huge, awful, smelly places. And they were a lot less expensive to the state. But we weren't supporting them enough that they were still staying in business. They were closing. Every year you'd lose another one. So that was. I'm condensing this, but that was one of the big battles, or big successful legislative interests I had in terms of prison reform. But that was an ongoing interest, an area that I supported. I was telling you, so much of what you do in the legislature is you look at the calendar 30 years later and you have no idea what all that stuff was. And most of it was sort of perfunctory, some of it was local bills. This is the stuff that keeps state government running. most of it's not even controversial. There are always a handful of issues every year that really define what's going on. And of course there's the budget. And that's always the big one. You know. But I've tried to, you know, single out some of the stuff where I was played a little bit of a role. Now, looking back, a lot of your time as a legislator, and it's an enormously time-consuming job. It's ruinous to any kind of, you know, real occupation where you make money. Is spent as a sort of an ombudsman, helping everything from local government, county governments, little city governments, with what they need, running interference for them with the state agencies, and helping your constituents. People get themselves into the most amazing messes. And they call you because they don't know what else to do. And sometimes it's people who are, you know, leaders, realtors who didn't renew their license in time, and all of a sudden they've got to go back to school, and they want you to, I don't know what they want you to do. You know, that sometimes it's people who are really poor, who have desperate problems and don't know where to turn. Sometimes it's completely inappropriate, and that's rare, but I mean, I do remember people coming to me wanting me to get someone out of jail, or, you know, just and offering money. You know, it's like, and they didn't know any better. You know, it's just. But I mean, you do field an awful lot of calls about all this other stuff that's really not a part of legislation and voting, and yet it's what you do.
In other words, your constituency knew you were there.
Yes, I guess that's a way to say that. Yeah.
That was your slogan.
Yep. Yeah.
Good.